Hi, everyone. It looks like we can go ahead and get started. We have a good group in this room. Welcome. Happy Social Work Month. What a great time to be together at a time where we can celebrate our contributions and also our profession. And I know it's also trying times for many in the world or many in our communities. And one of the things that had kept me comforted as I see how hundreds and thousands of people are fleeing violence right now from Ukraine and many other countries is the idea of coming together in the time of crisis and knowing that when we hurt together, we can also heal together. So today's conversation is going to bridge micro, meso, and macro, and we're gonna have a conversation, a dialogue with all of us here in this space. My name is Cheryl Aguilar, and I am in Washington, D.C. with the Hope Center for Wellness. But before I tell you a little bit more about myself and my colleagues, I just wanted to start with a shout out to the people who are in this chat and in this room. So we have, let's see who we have. We have representation from Howard University here in DC. Thank you for being here. Baylor University lives in Maryland and work in DC, so we're neighbors. I'm in Washington DC as well. Sacred Hearts in Connecticut. Howard, UPenn, UPenn, Silverman School of Social Work. I'm just getting excited reading where people are from and where people are at. So, but we can go ahead and see and welcome one another. So I think today's conversation couldn't come at a better time as we, as social workers, are always called to respond in times of crisis, but also respond when we're not in crisis and explore what we can do, whether it's micro, meso, macro, to support the communities that we serve. I am connected to CRISP in many different ways, but one most recent, I was a past board member last year. And I have been following the work of CRISP and Dr. Lewis Jr. for many, many years. And what a great platform that he has built to help us advocate for the communities that we're looking to serve. Hi, everyone, and welcome. So I am a social worker who believes that we cannot do micro without the macro. And I see that in my everyday work. I am a clinical social worker who provides therapeutic interventions for DC metro area members. And very early on in my work, I saw how environmental factors, and this is something we all learn in school, right? The environmental factors and the stressors in our communities impact our community members' mental health. So very early on, I saw that without immigration reform per se, my clients can continue to experience anxiety or depression. Most of the clients that I work with are immigrants, asylum seekers, or refugees. So it's part of the conversation today is the connection of policy with health and how policy impacts health and what we can do to advocate for better policies for our community. And today I have two very special guests. I'm always out to look out for social workers who are in this work. One of the things that we'll talk about today is how alone we can do very little, but together we can do so much. So the two colleagues that I have today are going to tell us a little bit about the work that they do and how we can all get involved in immigration. So Yasmin Compos-Mendez is currently the public policy manager with Esperanza United, formerly Casa de Esperanza National Latino Network. She completed her master's degree in social work at Columbia University in New York City with an emphasis of children and family policy. Yasmin has over 8 years of direct service work with immigrant survivors of domestic violence, and most recently has stepped into research and policy work. Her work focuses on ensuring that policies nationwide are responsive to the needs and realities of Latinx or Latino communities. She continues to advocate for enhanced rights and protections for immigrant survivors. I'm going to also introduce you to Brisa, and then they each going to share a little bit more about themselves. Brisa Trinidad is a graduate student at Columbia University School of Social Work, studying policy and international social welfare. She has experience working in the international humanitarian aid sector in Afghanistan, providing direct services to immigrant families in Central Texas, to working with unaccompanied children. In addition, Brisa is conducting research with Columbia University, focusing on the well-being of non-Syrian refugees in Turkey. This academic year, she's interning with the International Rescue Committee in New York City. So why don't we go ahead, and if there's anything that I left out that you would like to add, go ahead. Maybe Yasmin, we'll start with you, and maybe you can tell us your connection to CRISP and how you might have gotten involved in immigration.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to connect with you all, and really grateful for this chunk of your time. I hope that Student Advocacy Day has been fun so far. So I'll start a little bit, and thank you for that introduction, Cheryl. I don't have much more to add in the background, but I guess I could give a little bit of background of the connection with CRISP. I did my master's in social work at Columbia University from 2018 to 2020. And I participated as a student both years. The first year, 2018 to 2018, I believe, 19. I got to go to it was my very first time going to Washington, D.C. And I, similar to Cheryl, was wanting to do more of like a clinical background, but was really interested in the connection between micro and macro practice. And so came out to DC and participated and did some lobbying on the Hill. And it was just a really good experience. And so it kind of motivated me to explore a little bit more about just what it would look like to go into the policy field as a social worker. And so my final year at Columbia, I was out in Washington, D.C. There's a Fisher Cummings Fellowship that's very policy direct with Columbia. And so I was selected to go out to Washington, D.C. my final year and study policy. I was a policy fellow at the National Network to End Domestic Violence and was getting supervised by Dr. Lewis, and wanted to be more engaged on getting more social work students into policy work and advocacy, especially on a macro level. And so worked with him and actually helped direct the Student Advocacy Day 2020. And so that was a really great experience, and just grateful to stay connected. And now am here on this panel. But I'm sorry, Cheryl, was there another question that we also had lined up, or is it kind of just introductory into what brought us into CRISP?
Yeah, that question. And along the way, we're going to connect more about how we got involved in immigration.
Great.
To give people an idea about how we can all join the movement in whichever way we may be in. Thank you, Yasmin, for that. Brisa?
Hi, all, and welcome. My name is Brisa Trinidad, and I am a graduate student here at Columbia. My road to the policy track is more of a story as my observations working with unaccompanied children and immigrant families in Central Texas, and observing just the policies that impact their environment and thus their lives, and also taking into consideration my experiences working abroad in the international humanitarian aid sector, and thinking the impact and also the importance of the field of social work, and how that could contribute to the livelihood of individuals. Therefore, I am on the policy track here at Columbia. My connection with CRISP is through Professor Dr. Lewis, who is my field supervisor. So it's an honor to be here and just to share a little of during this presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. So for today's conversation, we're going, just to give you a little bit of logistic, are each going to share different perspectives in terms of micro, macro, meso, and what are some of the salient and most pressing issues on immigration today. We're going to together gain greater understanding of basics of immigration and what's at stake when it comes to policies that impact community members. And we're going to together have a conversation about ideas and about how to turn our frustration, anger, sadness that we may be experiencing as we see the world hurt and as we see refugees come into our country because they're being displaced from where they call home, how we turn our emotions into action. In fact, one of the part of my work that I do in my clinical work, and as I try to bridge into macro, is to really connect how emotions, how the political environment impact our emotions. And that's one of the topics that you're going to hear a little bit about throughout the our conversation today. And I wanted to start with something basic in terms of who are migrants, who are asylum seekers, and who are refugees. That's a question that I get asked a lot. And feel free to post your questions as well. Part of the conversation today comes from questions that I get asked a lot of times in conversations that I have about immigration. So we want to make sure that we tweak what we talk about today to what you would like to know about. But one of the questions that I get asked is, what is the difference between an asylum seeker, a refugee, and an immigrant? So immigrant is kind of like the umbrella term to refer to someone who changes their country of residence, independent of the reason for migration, whether they're being displaced, whether they're fleeing violence, poverty, or other dire conditions, or whether it's a voluntary migration or their legal status. So anyone who's in this country can be considered, who comes from another country can be considered a migrant, independent of the reason why they came here and their legal status. An asylum seeker is granted asylum after entering the country or while seeking admission at a point of entry. So to kind of localize that a little bit and put it into context, when we hear about migrants crossing the border and being detained at the border or being returned back to their country of origin or Mexico, which is an entry port, that's what we kind of refer to when we're talking about asylum seekers seeking to come into the United States and seeking to come through a point of entry. And refugee is granted refugee status while still outside of the United States. So recently, to put that into context, the administration announced that they will grant temporary protection status. That's actually another status that we'll talk about more, to refugees fleeing Ukraine once they arrive to the United States. But they also can be granted refugee status while still not having arrived to the United States. And when it comes to immigration statuses, we are going to be kind of weaving in different types of statuses. Undocumented, sometimes you will hear the word illegal. And when I hear the word illegal, I kind of cringe because we have been working really hard to destigmatize some of the language that can be penalizing and stigmatizing to community members. So when and you'll see a little bit maybe in the media, how the media has been some media have been trying to shift from using language like illegal immigrants to language that is less penalizing, like immigrants who are undocumented, which is a person first type of language. We do not personalize the documented status, but we separate it from the person. So an immigrant who has an undocumented status. There's also temporary statuses. You might have heard of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is for migrants who came before the age of 16 and who have gained temporary status and can work or go to school. And there's also more permanent statuses like U.S. residency and citizenship as well. And the reason why why we wanted to have this conversation, and this was actually Dr. Lewis Jr.'s vision, is because I don't know how many of you have heard this saying, the United States is a nation of immigrants. And I'm curious about what you may feel when you hear that statement. So feel free to add it in the chat. The United States is a nation of immigrants. What that really means is that the immigration population in this country is really growing. There's about 44 million of immigrants in the United States. And when it comes to a makeup of where immigrants come from, it's really important that we talk about the diversity of the immigrant community. Sometimes the media focuses on on specific regions of where people come from. Right now, we're hearing a lot of news about Ukraine, which I think is really important to put the spotlight in the communities who are hurting at the moment. And there's times when we hear a lot about the migration from Central America. We heard a lot about the migration from Haitian. We heard a lot about the migration from Afghanistan. So that just gives you an idea that immigration is really diverse, and we need to, as social workers, connect to not just what the media is reporting, but with the realities of what migration looks like. And sometimes that's not always reported. So just to give you an idea now, and we're going to connect a little bit more with the idea of refugees, because we're seeing that our brothers and sisters from Ukraine are going to be joining us and have already started to join us here in the United States. The refugee community in the United States has grown immensely in the last few years. There's currently about 26.6 million refugees in the entire world. So that's a lot of people everywhere. And when it comes to just to put it into context, the refugee community. So we're going to talk about specifically about the United States, but I want to broaden it because, as we know, in Ukraine, people are looking to go to different countries, not just the United States, but Poland and some of the bordering countries as well. The refugee population in the world equates to the population in Germany. 84 million people in the entire world are refugees. $50 million people have internally been displaced. And I'm going to explain what that is. 4.4 million asylum seekers, so the other category that we talked about. Most recently, about 4 million people, 4 million Venezuelans were displaced abroad, not just in the United States. And alone, we're hearing that in Ukraine, so far about 2 million people are looking to flee their country. To give you another context, in Central America, about 1 million people from Honduras fled in the last 8 years and fled coming into the United States. One of the questions that I get asked a lot, and we might have heard about, or we might have heard in the circles that we're in, is why do they come? We hear this a lot in the media trying to report, like, why is it that they come? As social workers, the question is why. It's not why do they come. The question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what do we do once we have new brothers and sisters or new community members who are part of our communities, of our churches, of our schools, of the fabric of our society? What do we do? How do we respond once they're here? So that's the question that as social workers, we need to be asking ourselves. But to explain that why do they come, we can look at it from something called the push and pull factors. So these are factors within environmental factors that perhaps lead people to leave, whether it's forcibly or willingly. So the push factors are factors that include violence, poverty, political unrest, natural disasters, and violence. And when we talk about violence, we're going to broaden violence to man-made violence, like gang violence, like the war in Ukraine, in those kinds of circumstances. And the pull factors are considered factors in which someone may voluntarily, and we can put a question mark to voluntary, someone who voluntarily may come seeking better opportunities, safety, and stability. And the reason why I put the question mark on voluntarily is I recently came, I'm going to put it a little bit into context. I recently came from Honduras, where I am from originally. And one of the questions that I think as an immigrant, I always ask myself is, and as I see through the work that I do with my clients, is what is that feeling of having to leave the place that you know home? So the reason why I put voluntary, because even if you're looking for other opportunities, we can make an argument somewhere else. We can make an argument about opportunities where people are at, and what is that feeling of not being able to get the opportunities that you dream about and having to go somewhere else to get them. I'm going to pause for a second just to see if there's any pressing questions that have come up. Okay. So I'm going to share a little bit, while this talk is not focused on clinical, I'm going to name a few clinical challenges that I see in the context of what we can expect when working with immigrants, asylum seekers, or refugees, and in the importance of creating or advocating policies that support people's mental well-being. So there's a few, I'm gonna kind of say it quickly, and then we're gonna connect it to the meso and the macro. But some of the challenges that we can kind of anticipate someone who may come to a new place of home, they call home, or they may call home in the future, is challenges with, sometimes we call it acculturation challenges with getting used to or to the new place they're in, new traditions, new rules, new norms, language, food, everything changes for many people. There, as many clients have shared with me, the whole world changes for me, and I have to get used to a new situation, and that takes time. I don't know if many of you have moved around, and this is just to give you a little bit of context. Just think about what that feeling may be of having to move somewhere new, whether that is in the next neighborhood from you or the next town over. Just kind of think about what that may entail, all of that. And so we're not just talking about neighborhoods, we're talking about an entire new country in the case of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. People may face the reality of what their immigration status may represent, if they have a temporary status, immigration status, if they have an asylum seeking status or refugee status, versus a more permanent status. There's some limitations with some statuses. I'll give you an example for that. I work with clients who are undocumented, with undocumented status in DC, and they have access to healthcare through Medicaid. They can have access to healthcare through Medicaid or through private insurance, but Medicaid does not allow them to, in DC at least, does not offer mental health, free mental health through Medicaid. So there may be some gains for some people with temporary statuses, but there's not access to everything that everyone else can get. So that's really important to kind of keep in mind. There may be, for people who have undocumented immigration status, there may be fear of deportation of self or loved ones. There may be a stigma and shame associated with what their immigration status may be. People experience discrimination, racial profiling, abuses at work, low wages, mistreatment, can lead to sexual assault and labor trafficking and human trafficking. And I know we're going to go a little bit more into that. Little or no access to services, sometimes little mobility, sometimes fear of authority figures, and we may represent an authority figure to our clients or the community members we're looking to serve. There's challenges dealing with family separations, family reunifications. Not all families are migrating together, and that causes stress within the family system. Children may end up in the foster care system or without their caregivers when their parents may be deported, and many other challenges. In terms of clinical diagnosis, we see depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex trauma, adjustment disorder, toxic stress, grief and loss, and sometimes self-esteem issues or self-worth issues connected to an immigration status, connected to how others may view me and others, we can talk about community as a whole. We can talk about politics, and we can think about what the last administration was like and the anti-immigrant rhetoric, and think about the impact that might have had on people's well-being. I had clients who wanted to self-deport or go back because they did not feel welcome in a country they have called home for a very long time. And while what I mentioned is a little bit clinical, the importance of putting that into context is that we need immigration reform. We need immigration policies that are trauma informed and that look at the health of an individual. We need to create a culture of health where policies directly respond to people's well-being and mental health. One example of a policy that did not do that and has created a lot of harm and trauma in our community is what is called the Trump zero tolerance policy, in which thousands of families were separated at the border. Children and parents were sent to detention centers. Children were sent to shelters. Some parents were deported. Until this day, there's hundreds of families who have not been separated. So that's an example of what we as social worker in a network that I'm a part of called Social Workers United for Immigration, called government-led trauma, government-led child abuse. There was a single policy that could have minimized or could have prevented the trauma in these children, but that single policy of separation led to kids experiencing PTSD and trauma and families being ripped apart. And so that is how we can come in as social workers, looking to connect those pieces and looking to advocate for policies that are fair, just, and humane. I'm going to take a quick pause, and I'm actually going to bring it back to one of my colleagues to continue the conversation, to bridge between the micro and the macro. And Yasmin is going to share with us a little bit around policies that are currently that we can be thinking about or we need to be advocating and are salient and pressing. And it gives us a little bit of the status of what policy may look like for us and what advocacy may look like for us. Yasmin?
Sorry, I'm trying to turn off my Teams chat. Sorry about that, Cheryl. You were, should I go straight into the work that I'm doing over at Esperanza United?
Yes, please.
So I wanted to kind of bring in just a little bit of my background because my work is very specific for immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And so there's the correlation of surviving violence, and then also, the kind of the some of the trauma that can come when you arrive to the country, and especially if there's not many support and programs and policies in place. So I work over at Esperanza United, formerly known as the National Latino Resource Center. And we are federally recognized as a national resource center for the Latino community. And what we do is we work to mobilize the Latino community, Latinx community, to end gender-based violence. And so kind of what drove me into this work is I was working with immigrant survivors in San Francisco. For those of you who are familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area, I was located in the Mission District, which is predominantly Latinx immigrant survivors, Latinx community, sorry. And so, my work started at a domestic violence shelter, and it was there when I started seeing just the needs and programs that didn't exist. I mean, I'm even at something that seems as simple as language access, not having someone at the family court to represent a survivor and advocate with them in their language, or during child protective services, during some of those family team conferences, right, where a family is with other social workers and sometimes attorneys. And so it really motivated me to see what we can be doing on the policy level, in programming, in trainings, and, you know, accessibility to language access, to bring into kind of back to what what we can do when we do have new brothers and sisters, right, in members of our community. And so bringing in that social work lens. And so with Esperanza United, we do national advocacy. And what that looks like is a lot of training and technical assistance to members of Congress in the House and in the Senate on bills that would and legislation that would advance justice for immigrant survivors. For example, one of our main projects right now is working to get higher appropriations. And so I'm happy to take any questions, but I know many of you, you know, may have a little bit of background in lobbying. And so appropriations is something that gets accumulated every year, right? Think of it as kind of our federal purse. And so there's a certain amount allocated for each committee, right, or area. And so with immigration, a lot of it would fall under the Department of Homeland Security. And so one project that we're working on and advocating towards is getting higher fiscal year appropriations in the Department of Homeland Security so that we can address things like the U visa. And I'll give a quick little overview on a U visa. A U visa is something, it's a humanitarian visa that an individual can apply for if there is, there's a lot of flaws in this still, cooperation with law enforcement on the abuse that they went through here in the U.S. And so it does create a pathway towards work authorization, and it does create a pathway towards a lot of different supports from mental health services, economic relief for undocumented immigrant survivors. And so, and I'm going to drop in some in the chat some links, but we also will provide a resource sheet that will have some of these different organizations and that you can definitely look into. But what I'll do right now is I'll drop in a quick link of a task force that I sit in. It's known as the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. And within that group, there is lobbying for the Federal Violence Against Women Act, which is a law that protects survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault from domestic violence shelters, from rape kits, from therapy clinics, things like that. And so within that task force, we have an immigration subcommittee, which I'm a part of, and that's the link I just dropped in the chat, called the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. I know I've given kind of a mouthload there, but I think one thing to keep in mind is, what are ways as a social worker that we can bring in these policy spaces, that in terms of advocacy. I think sometimes we are exposed or maybe even intimidated by being in some policy spaces as social workers, because we know we might not have that law degree or that background, but we do have that on the ground work. And on the ground work is so valuable because that is, where we can come in and talk to our members of Congress in the House, right, or our senators, which we do at Esperanza United, and we talk about real life stories that are happening, right? That there was a recent participant at our local domestic violence shelter. So Esperanza United does national work, but they do have services in Minnesota, St. Paul. And it was just the urgency and kind of addressing the dire need of what happens when somebody applies for a humanitarian visa, but because appropriations doesn't have enough funding and we don't have enough adjudicators looking into these cases, there becomes these backlogs of all of these U visas that still need to get approved. And so survivors, immigrant survivors, could be waiting, for years to get their case approved. And what does that mean? That means that there could be a risk of not having economic empowerment, not being able to find a stable, job. It can mean that some survivors may not really have a support system and may go back to their abuser because of all of these so many different complex dynamics. And so there are certain things that I do want to kind of end its takeaway points, is that, there's always opportunities to contact your member of Congress, your senators, and get involved by, subscribing to certain, organizations and their newsletters. And there's usually like policy action alerts and items that can keep you informed on what's happening and keep you able to track what's happening in immigration legislation, so that you can write to your senators, you can ask them what their position is on certain pieces of legislation. And as we're getting close to midterms, which are in November, it's important to reflect and kind of think about for those that can vote and are able to vote, where does my representative stand on immigration? Where do they stand on funding higher appropriations to be able to address some of these backlogs? And so I do want to open up some time for questions, but I would like to end just kind of with this debunking myths that we hear about immigration. So we hear a lot of common misconceptions about undocumented people, migration, and immigration statistics. And I kind of want to think about what could we do as activists and allies and social workers to help debunk them. And so one myth that I thought would be good bringing into this space is immigrants take American jobs. So we hear that a lot. And the fact is that immigrant workers often take jobs that boost other parts of the economy, right? When we're thinking about migrant workers, in places like California, Ohio, or so many other jobs that boost our economy. So it's important to recognize that undocumented workers do not take jobs from U.S. born workers. It's a myth that's been consistently debunked throughout years of economics research. And the reality is that undocumented immigrants fill crucial gaps in the workforce and largely, not competing with US born workers, but complementing them and creating greater economic activity and productivity that can help the country grow out of this pandemic-induced downturn right now.
Thank you for all of that, Yasmin, and I really appreciated you kind of calling us to action in terms of debunking the myth, not only learning what the facts are, but also helping others debunk the myth as well. One of the things that we also hear about too is why can't they get in line? And I think it's really important that people know that right now there's no line. What the line looks like for many families who quote unquote could come the right way, whatever the right way may be, is that some families have to wait up to 20 years in some cases, 10 to 20 years. And that's if they have a relative in the United States already who can petition them to come. Imagine for the families who don't have that. But imagine if you were a parent or if you were a child looking to reunite with a family member, having to wait 10 to 20 years. You basically miss a big chunk of their lives. And part of the challenge is that right now here in the United States, we don't have our immigration system is broken. So we certainly have to work towards comprehensive immigration reform and to reform some of the laws and policies for people fleeing situations like the situation in Ukraine and other countries as well. But thank you for that. And I think the call to action, I really appreciate Yasmin talking about connecting. I'm paraphrasing. I heard a call to action to connecting to organizations who are doing this work. So in DC, we have something called Social Workers United for Immigration. And it was literally a group of people, 12 of us, who one day decided to have a meeting and say, what can we do? Where is the voice of social workers in the immigration movement? And that group grew to about 90 people now. And we're not just in DC now, we're like all across the country. And we kind of come together around actions. So we share updates around immigration. We don't know everything there is to know about immigration, but we partner with organizations who inform us and let us know what are some opportunities ahead for action. So as social workers, as the primary providers of mental health in the United States, surpassing other professions, but also as macro social workers who are in the front lines, we have a unique voice to immigration, and we need to leverage that and also leverage the voices of the people that we work with.
I thank you, Cheryl. I actually, just hearing you say that, I think I just wanted to add one last point, especially just having this amazing platform with social workers right now is, given that many, and again, I really work predominantly with immigrant survivors of domestic violence, but within that, big chunk is women. And so given that many women and their families and just I'll keep it broad in general, survivors come to the U.S. to flee violence and seek asylum. I think a question that I would want to frame out is, how do we change the narrative around immigration to emphasize that it's not illegal to seek asylum? Asylum seekers are treated as criminals. And so I think putting it out there as a question to be thinking about, but, it's important to kind of answer that is that we change the narrative by becoming informed that protecting refugees and providing asylum is embedded in our laws as an expression of our commitment to welcome those who come to our shores, right, seeking safety and freedom. And so we, kind of ending with, we are big enough, we are, strong enough and smart enough as a nation to solve the problems we confront, even problems that have been long neglected or exacerbated by Trump and his zero tolerance approach. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure to get that in.
Great. I'm glad you did. Thank you so much. And now we're going to turn over to Brisa, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about what refugee resettlement means. I think that's something that I need to learn more about. So I really appreciate your contribution to this conversation. And what are we're going to learn a little bit more about that, but also the Migrant Protection Protocol and what that is and what that means to us. Go ahead, Brisa.
Thank you so much, Cheryl and Yasmin. It's very informative to hear your presentations. And just briefly, my name is Brisa Trinidad, and I am a graduate student at Columbia. My focus is on policy and international social welfare. I'm conducting research with Columbia and focusing on non-Syrian refugees in Turkey. And also currently I'm interning with the International Rescue Committee here in New York City with a team of research analysis and learning. So just just briefly just want to recap a wonderful definition of what Cheryl shared earlier of who is a refugee. So a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee from their country because of persecution, war, or violence. And a refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Before moving forward, though, I do want to acknowledge and stand in support and solidarity with Ukraine. And so, as we know, on February 24th, the Russian military invaded Ukraine. And the UNHCR, which stands for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, reports as of today, March 10th, over 2 million refugees are estimated to have fled to nearby countries, such as Moldova, Poland, Romania, and throughout the European region. It's also just important to know that this could be one of the largest humanitarian crises that Europe has experienced potentially since World War II. And so just acknowledging that, and also acknowledging that this is also happening in other parts of the world, such as Yemen, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Sudan as well. And so moving forward with that, so the backbone behind who is a refugee, there's legal documents, and two of which, the first one is the 1951 Refugee Convention, which defines and it's a protected legal document for international law for refugees. And so before moving forward with that, so who is an asylum seeker? When people flee from their own country and seek sanctuary in another country, they apply for asylum, the right to be recognized as a refugee and receive legal protection and material assistance. And so the primary difference between a refugee and an asylee is that a refugee is granted refugee status while still outside of the United States, and an asylum seeker is granted asylee status after entering the country or while seeking admission at a port of entry. So going back to what is the 1951 Refugee Convention and why is it important? And so this 1951 Geneva Convention is the main international instrument for refugee law. The convention clearly spells out who is a refugee and the kind of legal protection and other assistance and social rights they would receive in the country that they'll be hosted or be welcomed to. There's also this other piece to that, the 1967 protocol, which expands the scope of the convention to other regions of the world, not just Europe. And it's important to note that the cornerstone of the 1951 Convention is the principle of non-refoulement, which is contained in Article 33. And I do want to highlight that non-refoulement is quite an important term just to kind of put at your back pocket and just to know a little bit more about. So according to this principle, a refugee should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their safety or freedom, life or freedom. And so just moving forward with that, so we have the definitions of who's a refugee, who's an asylee, and the legal documents that support their pathway to safety into a new country. So what does refugee resettlement look like and why is it important? So refugee resettlement is a life-saving solution for most of the vulnerable refugees in the world. And it's also an important way to share the responsibility and support because most of the developing countries that host the majority of the world's refugees. And also just to recap, each fiscal year, the president declares a cap. And so the current refugee annual admissions for this fiscal year 2022 is 125,000, which is a significant increase from the former administration's refugee admission ceiling of only 15,000, which was a record low in the United States history. So just briefly, what is resettlement? We touched base on what is a refugee. And so resettlement is the careful selection of governments for purposes of lawful admission of the most vulnerable refugees who can neither return to their home country nor live in safety in their neighboring countries, host countries. And so it's also interesting to note that refugees do not apply for resettlement themselves. They're actually go through the UNHCR, and the UNHCR identifies cases to be considered for resettlement. And the most vulnerable refugees are then connected to a country or a government. And so vulnerable categories include children at risk, women and girls at risk, survivors of violence and torture. From there, countries decide which refugee to admit and resettle. And from there, in addition, the UNHCR conducts their own screening. And the US also conducts its own quite intensive vetting process themselves, which can take up altogether about 2 years. And then from there, the UNHCR refers a refugee to be considered for resettlement and provides background information. Again, it connects with one of the governments that the individual will seek safety to. And from there, for example, if they do enter the United States, the State Department assigns the case to one of the 9 US NGOs or resettlement agencies. From there, the resettlement agency helps refugees integrate and become more economically self-sufficient in their new U.S. community. I do want to connect this part, though, to why case management is important, and also with the values of social work, too. So case management is actually like well-established and important intervention that supports the successful adjustment and integration of refugees populations in the resettlement context. And so in general, it involves a range of client-centered services designed to strengthen individual and family access to social welfare, employment opportunities, healthcare, and just overall a welcome into their new home. And at times too, if legal services are needed, those connections are made as well. Before concluding, just touching base briefly on various policies. So there is one that's called the Migrant Protection Protocols that was enacted by the former administration. You may also have heard of this policy known as Remain in Mexico, which was a program initiated in January of 2019, through which asylum seekers were forced to wait in Mexico while pursuing asylum in the United States. So we just talked about refugees specifically. This is now focusing more on the asylum asylees and the asylum process in the United States. I do want to touch base a little on the non-refoulement and how that plays into migrant protection protocols, and as a piece in advocacy why migrant protection protocols or MPP should be rescinded. So under this policy, people fleeing persecution in their home countries have been forced to wait in dangerous cities along the potentially dangerous cities within the Mexico and US southern border. This policy requires asylum seekers to wait there while their cases are being processed in the United States, which this could usually take a couple of years. It has been reported that tens of thousands of people have been waited in unsanitary tent conditions before their immigration hearings. And there's also have been widespread reports of sexual assault, kidnapping, and torture. It's important to also highlight how MPP violates U.S. refugee law, non-refoulement obligations, and due process protections. And MPP is an illegal policy that violates U.S. refugee law treaty obligations and due process protections for asylum seekers. In 2019 through 2020, the former administration returned nearly 70,000 asylum seekers to Mexico. And, most of these individuals are not necessarily from Mexico. They come from other parts in the world. So they're being returned to a very unknown environment and with a greater risk of harm. There's been some movement to rescind the MPP policy through the current administration. In February of this year, the Supreme Court announced it will expedite review. The Biden administration will expedite this, and with the hope to rescind this policy. The process would take with the ruling by the end of the court's term this December. And also next month, the justices are called to expedite more of a briefing in the case so it can be heard in April. For more oral arguments why this policy is harmful. Before concluding, just a couple of takeaways. One is what we can do about advocating for Ukraine, and also what we can do about advocating for the Afghan families. And so with the humanitarian parolee and the temporary protection status, it's just important to stand to be aware of what these measures entail, and also what potentially could happen if the humanitarian and temporary protection status are granted, which will welcome individuals from Ukraine who are fleeing to join their families in the United States and to apply for protection here. You can also attend rallies and be informed to spread awareness, either as a practicing social worker or an aspiring social worker as a student. And also the advocacy for Afghan families. We saw this in August and during the summer where, for example, temporary protection status was granted to Afghan families and individuals fleeing the crisis in Afghanistan, and also humanitarian parolee. There is quite a difference between those two accesses into the United States. The humanitarian parolee only provides temporary, they can only be in the United States for a temporary time, most like about a year. And so the advocacy for Afghan families, now there's a Afghan Adjustment Act in Congress, which would allow about 36,000 Afghans living in the US under the humanitarian parolee to apply for permanent residency, which will then provide more of a long-term, well-being for them instead of potentially the risk of returning to harm. And so I did just want to end on those two notes and just some takeaways, but just thank you so much to just briefly listening to refugee, what is a refugee asylee, and also the resettlement process and the legal documents that build the framework for protection. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brisa. So we'll go ahead and take some of your questions right now, and we'll address some of the comments perhaps that that you have already added on the chat. But if there's any questions at this moment, so we're all going to be scrolling up and picking out some questions. Let's see. I think this is a great question. A little disclaimer, we may not get to all of them, and apology in advance for that. If there's anything lingering that we do not address today, feel free to email us at the email that I shared, and we'll try to address as much as we can afterwards. One of the questions is, what policy advocacy is being done on racial disparities with immigration policies? For example, the past cancellation of temporary protection status for Haitian immigrants was only recently reinstated in May 2021. That's an excellent question. And I think the question around who gets what and for how long and when, and the discrimination, we see that there's racism, discrimination, and inequity in distributing status to different groups. So this is an excellent question. I'm not currently aware about what advocacy is being in terms of if there's one particular policy piece that is being done on a racial disparities. I know that from what I have experienced with some of the immigration organizations and in the movement is that the movement or different organizations are trying to embed within the policy, within the advocacy for different groups. We're trying to perhaps diversify what the immigration dilemma or challenges are. I may not be saying that quite eloquently, but we are putting spotlights, and by we, I connect myself to the larger immigration movement, to the inequities that we're seeing. So something like this, a comment like this is really important, because we need to highlight, we need to be able to push for fair policies for everyone. And we do know that there's certain communities like the Black immigrant community who's often left behind. So I appreciated that comment, and I think it's a call of actions to us to ensure that we are kudoing for when we do get policies that protect groups, and we can use that information to leverage the support for all communities who are seeking asylum, refugee, and immigration status. There's an organization, in terms of an organization working specifically around Black immigrants' needs and challenges. There's an organization called Undocu Black, and that is included in a resource packet that we put together for this presentation. So if you're looking to get that, we can go ahead and email it after the presentation. Do we want to tackle one more question? We have a minute left. Any questions you see?
I see one by, I think it's Safoni Tracks. So I know there are work visas, student visas, and marriage visas. Are there any other kind of visas? So that could be, so in short, yes. And we won't have time to go into all of them because that would be a whole other webinar within itself. But I can say that there are humanitarian visas. And a few of those would be a U visa, which is one that I talked about. And if you, again, the list of resources that Cheryl can send out has organizations that are working on U visa advocacy. A U visa is a visa that you could obtain, but bear in mind, Congress created it to build trust with law enforcement and immigrant communities. And so you would have to go through this long process because there's such a backlog for it. And it's predominantly if you're a victim of a crime here in the United States. And it doesn't have to be a crime, that maybe happened through harm from a U.S. citizen. It can be a lot of different things, and there's a whole list of what qualifies that. And then there's a T visa, which is predominantly for immigrant survivors of human trafficking in labor, sex trafficking. A lot of kind of varies, but then there's also something called the vow of self petition, which is that was put into Congress under the Federal Violence Against Women Act, I think back in '94, and that is different in the sense that in order to qualify, the abuse had to have happened to an immigrant survivor that is married, and so it had to be with the spouse. And so you can see where there could be a lot of loopholes and oppressiveness within the way the legislation is written of who can qualify for that, especially in LGBTQ couples where marriage wasn't legal for so long here in the U.S. Right, so couldn't qualify for a vow of self petition if as an immigrant survivor is in a queer relationship. And so I'm going to drop my email here in the chat, and I'm happy to answer more questions around humanitarian visas and any kind of visas or a work authorization around immigrant survivors. And yeah, I definitely think that the resources that we'll be handing out will be helpful for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Yasmin. And Brisa, if you would like to share your email as well, or where people can contact you. And I want to thank everyone. I know you're jumping in, I think, to another session. I want to thank you for your time today. This is just the beginning of a conversation, and we will continue the dialogue in maybe this space by Chris, but another space, and just a few walkaways. Continue to get informed. There's still so much that we need to learn, that I need to learn. Take action, and action can look very differently. Call your Congress member, call your elected officials, send a letter, contact your media, get to social media, share petitions, sign petitions. A few years ago, we generated 3,000 signatures to a petition that was sent to Congress. Come together as social workers, create your own networks, ally with Chris. If you are a member of other social work organizations, get connected to the local networks, and together we can do so much. So I appreciate it, my colleagues and presenters for joining today, and all of you for being here today.